Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching The World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of the hour. The US and Iran agreed to hold talks in Oman on Friday despite sharp differences over the scope of negotiations. Washington seeks to include Iran's missile program while Tehran says only its nuclear file is on the table. Ukraine's military says it carries out successful strikes on a Russian ballistic missile launch site. Kyiv says buildings and a hangar are damaged at the Kapustin Yar range. China's leader Xi Jinping has called the Taiwan Strait the most important issue in US-China relations during a phone call with US President Donald Trump. Xi told Trump to be prudent when supplying weapons to the island, state media has reported. The Kremlin says Russia will continue a responsible approach to strategic nuclear stability. It confirms the New START treaty with the US expires at the end of Thursday. Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev says talks on a Ukraine peace deal show progress and positive momentum after negotiations in Abu Dhabi. He accuses Europe and Britain of trying to interfere with the process. Xi Jinping tells Donald Trump that Taiwan is the most important issue in China-US relations and urges prudence on arms sales. Trump describes the call as excellent and thorough amid efforts to stabilize ties. Russia says it expels a German diplomat in retaliation for Berlin's move against a Russian official. Moscow calls Germany's espionage accusations fabricated and a provocation. Pakistan's military says at least 216 militants are killed in operations in Balochistan province. Authorities say the security operation has now ended. We start this hour in Europe's east, and Ukraine, Russia and the United States have entered the second day of US-brokered peace talks in Abu Dhabi. US envoy has confirmed that Russia and Ukraine have agreed for a prisoner swap of war in their meeting in Abu Dhabi. Ukrainian negotiator Ruston Urumov confirmed the continuation of the talks, which remain focused on aligning positions through trilateral consultations and group work. While Kyiv described the first day of discussions of substantive and productive, no major breakthroughs have been made and differences between the parties persist. Russia's envoy Dmitriev called the talks positive, noting progress towards a potential peace deal despite pressure from the EU and UK to push for faster resolutions. Let's take a listen in.
Ну, как вы знаете, совместно с администрацией президента Трампа идет активная работа по восстановлению отношений Россия-США по экономическому направлению, вот в том числе в рамках российско-американской группы по экономическому сотрудничеству. И мы в том числе встречались сегодня, и встречи идут позитивно.
Кирилл Александрович, а есть ли прогресс по мирному соглашению?
Вы знаете, здесь неким индикатором может быть то, что вот разжигатели войны из Европы, из Британии постоянно пытаются помешать этому процессу, постоянно пытаются в него влезть. И вот чем больше таких попыток происходит, тем больше мы видим, что, безусловно, прогресс есть и идет хорошее позитивное движение вперед.
Но здесь в Абу-Даби помешать невозможно, я полагаю.
Ну, им сложно, но они...
Meanwhile, back in Ukraine, a Russian drone attack on Kyiv has left 2 people injured and caused damage to residential buildings and an office structure. As per reports, Ukrainian air defences shot down most of the drones, but some debris still caused significant damage. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, a Russian affairs expert. He joins us live from Brussels. Thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. Of course, talks have entered their second day with positive words from both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. Do you have any hopes for today, Gilbert?
Well, if there are hopes, they won't be announced to us. The Russians, the Americans are doing everything possible, and the Ukrainians are participating in this secrecy, which is essential to its success. So I have no criticism of the way they're proceeding. but they do leave us in the dark. And what is being released by Mr. Kirill, the spokesman for the Russian side that you have put on air, is to divert us from the reality of the substance of the conversations. Mr. Dmitriev is telling us that they're about improving relations, trade relations. Well, of course, there must have been some talks on the sidelines of that. And after all, that is the area of his own personal expertise, representing Russia for the sake of improving commercial ties. But that's not what they're spending 2 days in Abu Dhabi discussing, nor are they spending 2 days in Abu Dhabi discussing the prisoner exchange. That is a line of communication between the Ukrainians and the Russians that has been going on separately under the aegis of Mr. Medinsky, who was formerly the head of Russia's negotiating team. What they're talking about is the Ukrainian capitulation, and they do not want to call that out until all the terms have been agreed. That there is a capitulation under discussion. The Ukraine is going to give up the territories that the Russians demanded in Donbass is 100% certain. When today's New York Times features an article saying that recent polls show that the Ukrainian population is now 40% disposed towards giving up Donbass, it's probably an underestimate. The Ukrainians don't know about the $700 billion in financing that will come to Ukraine if they agree to this deal. If they learn about that, then it won't be 40%, it will be 90% in favor of giving up to the Russian demands. So a lot is going on, but we're not hearing about it.
Yeah, indeed. And security guarantees, you've spoken about territory, of course, is the most pressing point. How likely are we do you think we're going to see information on them anytime soon? We now know that the document is finished and Donald Trump is yet to sign it, but we don't know much about it. What more can you tell us on that?
Well, the American involvement in security guarantees will probably be significant, but not in the sense that most media expect. The United States is not going to put boots on the ground. It will not allow Europeans to put boots on the ground because the Russians are firmly against that and will resist any such attempt. There will be a more sophisticated type of security guarantee, mostly of a financial nature. That is to say, if the Russians should violate the terms of the peace, then they will lose advantages that are now being given to them, or will be given to them, once they sign the peace treaty. By that I mean the lifting of sanctions and other benefits that are substantial to Russia if the peace goes through. But it will not be boots on the ground. We'll hear about this when a complete agreement is reached with all aspects, because it all fits together. And just to talk about the security guarantee separately at this point does not make much sense.
Something that hasn't been talked about much is the minerals deal that was signed in April of last year. Of course, that grants the United States access to some of Ukraine's mineral-rich east. How is that going to play into these negotiations, and is that leverage that Ukraine holds?
I don't believe that there's any leverage there, and I don't believe it had any substance from the very beginning. It was being used by Donald Trump to show that he was going to claw back some of the $350 billion in assistance that he says the Biden administration gave to Ukraine, a totally inflated figure, of course, but that he would claw something back for the benefit of American taxpayers. The notion, there was talk about the United States getting a share in the energy mix in Ukraine, taking a share in the power generation at the largest nuclear plant in Ukraine that is now held by the Russians. All of these were nice talking points to keep the press distracted from the reality. Ukraine has nothing in mineral rights to interest the United States, finally. What they had is largely in Russian hands, and there it never amounted to much. The Russians had very good geologists, they had very good mining experts who never developed these resources because they weren't commercially viable. And that hasn't changed. So I don't believe that that component that originally was talked about so much by Trump has any relevance today.
And there's statements coming from Zelensky today that he estimates about 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers have died in the war. This is, of course, widely disputed We don't know how many soldiers have died on either side confirmed as of yet, but of course some figures put that up as above or up to 500,000 people, some even more. How credible are those numbers coming from Zelensky today?
Well, let's look at what the Russians are saying. It's more or less being admitted that at least 150,000 Russian soldiers have died in this conflict, and probably more like 200,000. The ratio of kill from Russians to Ukrainians is at least 7-1, maybe 10-1. So we just do the arithmetic. If 200,000 Russians have died, then at least 1.5 million Ukrainian soldiers have died. That's the reasonable number.
Okay, and of course this comes after Putin and President Xi of China also had a phone call within the past day. Do you see China at all getting involved a bit more when it comes to this conflict and putting an end to it? Of course, as other leaders have put pressure on Beijing, or at least floated the idea of them putting pressure on Putin to close this war off.
Well, there's a lot of talk about putting pressure on China, particularly with respect to its oil imports from Russia. Everyone has talked a great deal about India and India cutting back on its imports of Russian oil, which is true. They're not buying from the two sanctioned Russian oil drillers and exporters, Rosneft and Lukoil. But of course, they're importing something. China, nonetheless, was a much bigger importer of Russian oil. And China buys it with real money, with real convertible money, yuan, whereas India was buying it with inconvertible money that's just been piling up in the ledger books among the financiers, but does the Russian army no good whatsoever. The Indian oil was coming by sea. The Russian oil to China is largely coming by pipelines and is invulnerable to sanctions. So in general, the notion that pressure can be put on China in the single biggest area in which it is, shall we say, aiding the Russian war effort by its purchase of oil, there is no leverage whatsoever.
Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, do stay with us as we turn to our next story, and we head to East Asia. And the Kremlin expressed regret over the expiration of the New START treaty, the last remaining agreement governing the nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov described the treaty's end as a negative step, emphasizing the importance of the agreement in limiting the number of nuclear warheads deployed by both sides. Following the treaty's expiration, China announced it would not participate in nuclear disarmament talks. Let's take a listen in.
维护开放、包容、普惠的国际贸易环境，符合各国的共同利益。各方都有责任为维护关键矿产的全球产供链稳定与安全发挥建设性作用。同时，我们反对任何国家以小圈子的规则破坏国际经贸秩序。
The treaty's expiration marks the first time since the Cold War that the US and Russia lack a formal framework to regulate their strategic nuclear stockpiles. Experts warn that the loss of the treaty will increase political risks and diminish transparency in global arms control. Joining us now is Dr. Satoru Nagao, a fellow at the Hudson Institute. He joins us live from Tokyo to discuss this further. The treaty, of course, Dr. Nagao, did not eliminate nuclear weapons, but imposed verifiable limits and inspections. In practical terms, what becomes riskier now that there are no binding caps or inspection mechanisms between the United States and Russia, two of the largest nuclear powers in the world?
In this case, transparency is a risk because under the treaty, both sides check for which purpose warhead they can check each other. So that's why they can limit the number of the nuclear warhead. But another risk is exists. So that's why this treaty has expired, which is China. Because China is increasing the warhead very drastic pace, every year 100 nuclear warheads they are producing. So currently 600 or 700, something like that, but it will reach 1,000 in 2030 or 1,500 in 2035. So, and this 1,500 is the key because under this treaty, the US and Russia both deployed nearly 1,500 nuclear warhead to use anytime. So that's why they deployed. Total number of the nuclear warheads they have is more bigger, the 5,000, 600,000 level. But the deployed one is limited under the treaty is 1,500 this level. But if China increasing this warhead 1,500 level, to deter both Russia and China, the US need to deal with two 1,500 nuclear warheads at the same time. So this means that the United States need to increase nuclear warheads double, at least deployed one they need to increase. So this means that view from the nuclear deterrence, if the U.S. continue to stay in this new START treaty, the U.S. cannot deal with both Russia and China to deter the attack. So that's why ending this treaty or expire this treaty, in both cases there is a risk. So which risk is more better? That is a matter, and the final decision is expiring this treaty and try to seek a new treaty which include all of the three countries. That is the decision this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nagao, for joining us here on the broadcast. It's of course always a pleasure to talk to you. We now move on to our next story and a related development. NATO has urged responsibility and restraint as the new START treaty between the US and Russia imposing limits on their nuclear arsenals expired, raising fears of a new arms race. According to reports, Russia and China were both ramping up their nuclear capabilities and that NATO will continue to take steps necessary to ensure its own defences. Meanwhile, China has continued to rapidly expand and diversify its nuclear arsenal with more warheads and a larger number of sophisticated delivery systems. However, the Kremlin has said that it has regretted the end of last treaty governing the nuclear arms arsenals of Russia and the United States and called it a negative step. Gilbert Doctorow joins us once again to discuss this. Does Russia's response truly indicate that it is open to nuclear cooperation with the United States here, and a lack of US response as of yet? What does that signify? Can you hear me, Dr. Doctorow? Okay. Apologies there. We seem to be having some issue with Gilbert there. Hopefully he joins us back once again. The Kremlin has, of course, signalled its regret over the end of the nuclear START treaty, a treaty that has been in place for decades now. Gilbert Doctorow joins us once again to discuss this. The Kremlin here expressing regret over the end and the expiry of the new START treaty. Does that indicate that Russia is open to nuclear cooperation? And what is the indication of a lack of a US response or statement here?
Russia is definitely open to discussion with the United States and negotiation of a new treaty, a new agreement regarding the strategic nuclear weapons. At the same time, the remarks that we have just heard from Peskov and others on behalf of the Russian government are shedding crocodile tears. The Russians don't have any serious regrets that this treaty has been abrogated or has fallen into disuse, because they had serious problems with that treaty. After all, the treaty required they put their heavy bombers, which are part of their nuclear triad, that they leave them open on their airfields which exposed them to a rather treacherous attack by Ukraine, hitting airfields from Murmansk out to Irkutsk and destroying a fair number of those bombers. So that provision in the treaty, of course, was no friend to Russia. Moreover, the treaty lost its real value more than a year ago. The real value of the treaty was that it required regular and permanent inspections on the ground by the Russians, looking at American nuclear installations and warheads, and conversely, the Americans coming to the Russian nuclear installations and warheads. And Mr. Putin said openly, we remain, we do not cancel the treaty, but we withdraw, we suspend that part of the treaty. And that part of the treaty, the inspections, was the real core of the whole document, because it meant that there was confidence building, there were personal relations between the American and the Russian technical experts, which meant that there was minimal risk of some accidental nuclear war. That was canceled by Mr. Putin, saying rightly that de facto the United States and Russia are in a state of war, even if not de jure, and therefore it is inappropriate for us to invite American experts to our most secret and important nuclear installations. So effectively speaking, this treaty ended a year and a half ago.
And Gilbert, is it possible at this stage to negotiate anything new, or does the conflict have to come to an end before that can be really and realistically put on the table?
Well, I wouldn't leave it so open-ended that the conflict comes to an end, but because the conflict may come to an end in 1 or 2 months if these negotiations now going on in Abu Dhabi succeed, as they have a good chance of doing, or it may go on for several more years. So I don't believe that the Russians or the Americans want to leave it so open-ended that years go by before there is a new treaty. So something will happen, probably within the coming year, if not in the coming months.
Dr. Gilbert Doctorow, thank you as always for joining us. It's a pleasure to get your insight and perspective on these issues. We now move over and to Scandinavia, and the trial of Marius Borg Høiby, the son of Norway's crown princess Mette-Marit, has entered its 3rd day at Oslo District Court. Prosecutors have accused Høiby of a total of 38 offences, including 4 counts of rape, making this one of the most high-profile trials in Norway in years. Over the first 2 days, the court heard opening statements and details of the rape allegations, with one woman giving evidence in a closed session. Høiby has pleaded not guilty to the rape charges while partially admitting other offences, including bodily harm, violating a restraining order and transporting marijuana and speeding. The case has put the royal family under rare scrutiny in Norway, with a verdict expected at a later date. We stay in Europe now and over to Iberia, and Spain has recorded its highest weather alert for torrential rain in the southern region of Andalusia. Storm Leonardo has caused more than 40 centimetres of rain, which has led to the evacuation of thousands, while one woman is reportedly missing. The storm has obstructed rail and road transport. Last week, the heavy rains claimed 5 lives and left hundreds of people injured in Portugal. Spain's emergency military unit and police officers continue to evacuate residents and animals from flooded areas, while Portuguese firefighters continue their rescue operations. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.